This could change the world.
Could be, big deal. Afternoon, everyone. My name is Josh. I'll be judging today. My preferred pronouns are he, they. Judge neutral language is fine. I'll let the rest of the judges introduce themselves.
Yeah, my name is Gus Hariri. I'm
Cool. Let's go around teams, getting speaking orders and preferred pronouns. An open government.
Adam should be first here, they please.
Nathan, I prefer you than one day as well.
Cool. Over the opposition.
Ingo first, no preference.
No preference.
Cool. Closing government.
Oh, John speaking first.
Alex as well, both no preference.
Cool. And the closing up.
Who's speaking first here, they please?
We'll speak second here.
Cool. Would you mind timing management?
Yeah, and I have debate keeper guys, so you will be hearing these things.
Marvelous. Any questions about motion, standing order? Why we're here? I can't answer it. I can't answer that last one. Cool. Without further ado, top one.
We think we're at a time where Africa is working more closely together than ever before. Things like the African Union, things like the Tripartite Free Trade Agreement shows that Africa can work when it works together and can work for the most amount of people. What we also think is currently happening in Africa is you've countries like Ethiopia and Nigeria that are accelerating at rapid rates with long-term foreign direct investment at the expense of everyone else in that country. I think the best way to get the most developed Africa that relies least on the West is have an Africa that develops from within. We think that comes from these kind of trade deals. I'm going to talk to you about three main things: how we think these deals would work, secondly, the indirect impacts of having a trade deal of this extent, and then thirdly, how it mitigates the harms of status quo. So how do we think it works? We think it works similarly to Tripartite Free Trade Agreement that exists in Africa under status quo that has almost 30 members in it. We think it does things simply like harmonizes working policies, does things like reduces tariffs on borders, so there's access to free competition. We think things like reduces tariffs on imports and exports. We think very simply it works the same way as majority of any kind of free open trade agreements would work, and we think they could work under Africa and status quo, so we don't see how it wouldn't. Just on the impacts of what we clarification. Yeah. Well, like nations can opt out if they want to, but we think given the massive financial incentives, we don't think they would do. But under like status quo, we see countries like Tripartite Trade Agreement, or we see other trade deals where there's significant incentives for them to do so. First point on impacts. What we say is a big problem that limits any of African development is too many borders. That mean when you try to trade goods across borders, it's significantly expensive to do so. It is a fact that it takes 12,000 different forms to move something from the top of Africa to the bottom of Africa. It sounds ridiculous and ludicrous, but that is the kind of bureaucracy that happens when you have states that don't often function in the way that's easily possible. When the point at which you have a trade deal and you harmonize these borders, it means it's significantly easier for you to trade across them. Why do we think it's better? We think on a macro level, it's easier for you to do business across the wider variety of Africa when you can trade things freely. That means when you're a company who wants to do things like export oil to a neighboring country or to somewhere richer like South Africa, it's significantly easier to you to do so and not to rely on other companies to the point at which you can afford to do so. We think on a micro level, it means when you're a business, you can trade across borders easily or import things from neighboring countries without having to pay high amounts of tax. We think that's better for the economy developing in itself. Secondly, we think there's a massive lack of incentive in Africa under status quo to do things like create linked infrastructure. Note that the vast majorities of high-speed rail and motorways that exist between mainly South Africa and then countries like Nigeria and Ethiopia, because they're the most economically developed states, because there's the most incentives to do so. Because when you don't want to trade with those other states, so you don't have that incentive due to tariffs, you don't build those motorways. That means when those countries try to develop, they find it significantly harder to do so. Under status quo, they do things like rely on countries like China, who screw them over in trade deals to take things like oil to build infrastructure. We think at the point at which Africa is united and I as a country have an incentive to trade across another border, we think infrastructure is more likely to go together. We think that binds Africa closer. I think what we say is also is to having product and trade regulations just means on the ground you can have better products for people, easier for people to access things like workers' rights. Note, we don't have to stand over the same workers' rights that exist in things like the EU. We think these are developing emerging economies. We think we specifically stand over workers' rights and make it better for people on the ground. And finally, what we say is what's crucially important is how it specifically impacts these people. Because at the point at which you have a comparative advantage, because note that fundamentally means that I can now buy goods from another country and focus on what I'm directly benefiting from. Because the problem that exists under status quo is countries like Nigeria recognize it's too expensive to do things like trade with neighboring states. So the point at which these things like import from countries like China who offer them incentives to do so. That means those neighboring states never benefit in the same way they would have. When I have an incentive now to trade with those states, we think it's crucially important. Why else do we think it's better? Because when Africa has more money, it can do things like pursue aims that crucially benefit itself. We think the biggest aim the tripartite free trade agreement tried and successfully was able to do, I think other traders can do, is do things like pool money together and do perform things like create a development bank. I think a huge problem that exists under status quo is African economies lack the economic incentives or the like finances to ever do those kind of trade deals or ever want to cooperate with other people. At the point at which I have an incentive to trade with other countries, that means I'm more willing to do things like a development bank, because now I have an incentive to care about what Lesotho do, or I have an incentive to care about Burkina Faso's economy at the point at which it benefits me. That means you get an Africa that develops more so, and countries that care fundamentally more about developing that state. We think that's crucially important. Why do we think it benefits them? We think, number one, it massively benefits manufacturing industries in countries like South Africa or Kenya, who specifically look for a market to sell those kind of goods. The ability for them to sell those goods across borders without a tariff gives an impact of cheaper goods for those people in other states who previously had to pay high tariffs. You know, that what we stand over is a system where people get better quality goods and get them cheaper. We think you specifically get it on our side of the house. I'll take a POI if someone has one.
What do you think is going to benefit most from this trade agreement?
Like, I think when the EU was set up, probably countries like Germany and the UK benefited, but also note that that trickles down to Eastern European countries getting things like development and specifically benefiting. We think like South Africa and Nigeria are going to be particularly happy that they get a free trade border. We also think the ability, more on mitigating harms in a minute, but the ability for me as a small economy to now, or as a small business to now sell across the border to another market is a particular strong incentive that you get on our side of the house. So I'm going to talk about mitigating the harms of status quo, because note the huge harm that happens to African economies, and it's the reason why countries like Mali can never develop an agricultural industry. It's other trade blocs like the EU always dump their excess products on Africa because there's a financial incentive to do things like destroy Mali's ability to develop things like wheat. So use the EU can sell them wheat at higher prices. That specifically happens because countries like Mali lack the ability to trade with other countries around them due to high tariffs, and it's significantly easier for those countries to then buy off the EU. At the point at which you have a wide open, or the point at which you have a free trade corridor, there's now an incentive for countries around you to do things like buy country or buy products off neighboring countries. That means even you get cheaper products. That means when I have a country weighing up whether I'm going to buy cheaper goods from the EU or weighing up whether I'm going to buy and have trade ties with someone close to me, we think you're significantly more likely to buy those goods from a fellow neighboring country at the point at which they're cheaper. That means you mitigate the harms of like trade blocs like the EU destroying those economies. We think that's something that's incredibly more important. What you mainly do, and why this is quite a good foreign policy, is you reduce the impact and reliance on foreign countries, because countries like China come into areas like Nigeria and flood them full of workers and flood them full of profit because they have an incentive to do things like offer you a comparator. When I don't have an incentive specifically, or I lack the means to ever want to build that motorway, I do things like the Chinese government do things like specifically offer me the ability to build that motorway or a small amount of money in exchange for my massive amounts of oil fields or natural gas. Now those countries always lack the incentive and most importantly lack the capital to do so because they don't have the cooperation with other countries. That means they're always, that means when countries like China trade with them or do things like take over the goods, they're always left with a worse quality deal. That's why it's specifically harder to ever develop. At the point which I have an incentive, and point which borders are reduced, I can now know that I don't have to rely on a country like China because it's equally an incentive for someone else to build that infrastructure, or more importantly, there's other options for me to trade with. But you're less likely to ever rely on those countries. You get better ability for people to like harvest their own natural resources. We think time for Africa's economies to develop is now. We think it's happening under status quo. I think it happens a lot better at the point at which you free trade. Beg you to propose.
Second speaker for their speech of one.